For nearly 200 years, a single family line living deep in the Kentucky mountains passed down a hidden genetic mutation. When the right combination of genes locked together, their children were born, with skin the color of bruised steel. They were not sick, and their hearts pumped normally, but their bodies carried a rare blood condition that turned their faces, hands, and lips deep blue. The evidence of that mutation is still moving through American bloodlines today. The surface of this region looks completely ordinary to anyone driving near the town of Hazard. Main Street fills with traffic, and kids ride bikes on the pavement when the intense summer heat finally drops. Two-lane roads bend along the twisting waterways of eastern Kentucky, passing the local courthouse and gas stations. Narrow paths run past old farmhouses, leaning wooden barns, and small diners packed with work trucks. People here know the look of these mountains by heart. Watching the heavy fog sit low in the early mornings, they watch deer cross the blacktop at dusk and follow trucks climbing the steep grades slowly during winter snows. High mountain ridges covered in thick hardwood forests, close and tight on both sides of the highway. Those steep hills create natural walls around a specific stretch of water called Troublesome Creek. Life out here ran simple and hard for a long time. Families worked small hillside farms, hauled massive timber, and eventually dug coal tunnels deep into the surrounding rock. The landscape made travel incredibly difficult before modern infrastructure arrived. Going to the next county meant riding horseback over rugged trails or walking for hours along muddy creek beds. Heavy rain easily turned those narrow footpaths into impassable mud. Few locals owned horses or wagons strong enough to survive long mountain travel. Because movement took massive effort, communities along the water stayed strictly local. Neighbors married neighbors, and last names like Smith, Combs, Stacy, and Fugate repeated across courthouse documents. Relatives shared ancestors and built their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. This intense geographic isolation created the perfect environment for a rare biological trait to survive. The history starts with a man named Martin Fugate, who arrived in the valley looking for land. Records show he built a cabin near the creek around 1820 and married a local woman named Elizabeth Smith. Both of them looked entirely normal. Neither showed any visible signs of carrying anything unusual in their biology. However, both quietly carried one copy of a recessive trait tied to a condition called methemoglobinemia. This biological marker alters the chemical behavior of hemoglobin inside the red blood cells. Normally, that protein binds to oxygen in the lungs and releases it into the body's tissues. The genetic mutation causes a different form of the protein to build up. This altered version holds onto the oxygen far too tightly and refuses to let it go. The restricted oxygen flow turns the blood a noticeably darker shade. That darker blood shows through human flesh, changing the skin tone from pink to a distinct slate blue. The trait operates on strict mathematical rules because it is recessive. A child must inherit one faulty copy from the father and one from the mother for the color to appear. If a person inherits only a single copy, they remain completely clear-skinned and healthy. Martin and Elizabeth had 7 children together in their mountain cabin. Because both parents were carriers, the biological math caught up with their offspring. 4 of those children were born with skin that looked bright blue. Each child born to 2 carriers faces a 1 in 4 chance of inheriting double copies. They also hold a 1 in 2 chance of carrying a single invisible copy forward. The remaining probability means a child receives no copies of this mutation at all. In a bustling city environment, a recessive marker like this dilutes and vanishes within a few decades. Urban residents constantly meet outsiders, expanding the gene pool and dropping the odds of 2 carriers ever meeting. Troublesome Creek offered no such dilution. The ridges blocked new settlers from entering the deep hollows. Dirt roads simply ended in creek beds, stopping further travel entirely. 13 of the original Fugate children and grandchildren married cousins or close kin living in the same local network. They married heavily into nearby clans, permanently intertwining their bloodlines with the Combs, the Richies, and the Smiths. Geneticists call this concentration a founder effect. The valley operated as a closed loop, forcing the hidden gene to circulate continuously through the exact same families. A child might be born looking entirely normal, yet secretly carry the marker inside their blood. Decades later, when two of those invisible carriers had a child together, the blue skin would suddenly surface again. Sometimes the condition skipped an entire generation before reappearing in a grandchild. The mutation rarely caused any severe physical weakness or illness. The bodies of the carriers simply adapted to the shifted oxygen levels over time. Residents along the creek watched these children grow up, work the farms, and raise their own families without issue. The local community accepted the color as a strange but harmless part of their environment. They called them the Blue Fugates and went about their daily business. Old photographs show a woman named Luna Fugate sitting calmly on her porch, her skin displaying a heavy blue tint. Another descendant named Zachariah Fugat caused travelers to stop and stare when he visited nearby towns. Despite the intense staring from outsiders, he farmed his land and lived a completely regular life in the hills. While the locals understood the families, outsiders carried heavy stereotypes about Appalachian communities. Families carrying the trait quickly learned to stay silent to avoid cruel gossip and brutal ridicule. Children were taught to never discuss their skin color with strangers passing through the hollows. The absence of easily accessible doctors meant the condition remained a total medical mystery to the families experiencing it. Some older residents guessed the color came from drinking particular creek water or breathing cold mountain air. Those guesses missed the actual truth, waiting quietly inside their own cellular structure. The strict isolation finally began cracking during the middle of the 20th century. Coal companies expanded operations, pushing new roads through the previously uncrossable mountain gaps. Automobiles slowly replaced horse wagons, and centralized schools brought teenagers from different hollows together. 19th century medical journals contained scattered reports of rare European families carrying similar oxygen disorders. Those distant cases stayed buried in academic texts because rural doctors almost never encountered the symptoms. A hematologist from the University of Kentucky named Madison Coween decided to investigate the old rumors spreading out of Perry County. He drove into the hills during the 1960s and managed to locate several descendants who still carried the visible trait. Coween met a man named Patrick Riddle, whose lips and hands showed a strong bluish shade. Blood tests confirmed the high presence of methemoglobin. The physician realized that iron inside their blood was changing form, fundamentally limiting how oxygen attached to the cells. He brought a remarkably simple treatment into the valley to reverse the process. Coween administered an injection of a chemical compound known as methylene blue. The treatment sounded almost ironic to the patients receiving it. They were taking blue medicine to cure their blue skin. The chemical rapidly converted the trapped methemoglobin back into a normal oxygen-carrying state. Within a matter of minutes, Riddle watched his deep blue skin fade into a healthy pink. The visible color vanished completely, but the underlying recessive genes remained entirely untouched. The mutation simply went back into hiding. The sheer durability of that genetic code shocked a room full of medical professionals in 1975. A newborn baby named Benjamin Stacy arrived at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. At first, the delivery seemed flawless to the attending staff. The infant cried heavily and his breathing sounded robust. Minutes later, the nurses watched in horror as his flesh darkened rapidly. His face, arms, and chest turned a terrifying shade of purple-blue, resembling slate rock after a heavy rain. In newborn wards, sudden blue skin universally signals massive oxygen starvation from lung failure or a collapsing heart. The medical team immediately prepared for a full emergency blood transfusion to replace his failing supply. Yet the hospital monitors attached to the baby told a drastically conflicting story. His blood pressure remained perfectly steady. His heart pumped with total regularity. Oxygen flowed effortlessly in and out of his tiny lungs, ruling out standard cyanosis. The baby was not suffocating, but his skin looked dangerously dark. The entire room stood baffled until Benjamin's grandmother arrived and stepped in. She casually informed the panicked doctors that the boy's family line traced directly back to the blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek. That single sentence halted the emergency transfusion preparations. The doctors tested his blood chemistry and found massive levels of methemoglobin. They administered methylene blue, and the terrifying color faded away almost instantly. As Benjamin grew older, his body adjusted its own chemistry, and the severe newborn tint never returned. He represents the last known severe case of the condition tied specifically to that region. The highway systems and expanding job markets had finally shattered the tight marriage circles of the mountains. Younger descendants moved away from the creeks, carrying their silent genes into massive new populations where they would likely never meet another carrier. The story seemed entirely finished until the 2010s brought a massive wave of consumer DNA testing. Millions of people bought ancestry kits, spat into plastic tubes, and waited for their heritage reports. These modern genomic tests screen for deep historical markers and hidden carrier statuses. People living thousands of miles away from Kentucky suddenly received alerts flagging them as carriers for a bizarre blood condition. They possessed normal skin, normal lives, and no knowledge whatsoever of the Appalachian hills. When genealogy experts began mapping these scattered DNA results backward through time, the disparate branches converged. The digital family trees pointed straight past the modern cities and funneled directly into the eastern Kentucky ridges. Pedigree research tracking marriages across decades showed a tight cluster of the gene variation matching the old records. A software engineer in a coastal city or a mechanic in the Midwest might discover their genetic code traces precisely back to a small cabin built around 1820. The rare mutation hadn't been destroyed by modern society. It had simply hitched a ride on the outbound highways, dispersing silently into the massive American genetic pool. The invisible marker still sits quietly inside thousands of ordinary people right now. This kind of intense geographic shaping of human bloodlines is not an isolated event. Across eastern Kentucky, narrow valleys exist, exactly like the one that held the Fugate family. A single creek runs down the middle, flanked by towering ridges that force the roads to hug the waterline. For many decades, these deep hollows operated as completely sealed environments where families built enduring lives. Relatives lived mere miles apart, attending the same small churches and hunting the same rugged timberlands. This deep connection to the ground shaped everything from their daily labor in the deep coal mines to the very biology flowing through their veins. The extreme physical isolation that forced those genes into a tight circle is mostly gone today. Paved roads currently carry heavy daily traffic over the ridges and down into the Hazard Valley. The old wooden barns and leaning mailboxes remain standing right where they always have. Mailboxes still line the narrow road beside the moving water. Houses still sit along the exact same narrow strips of land beside the creek. Gravel roads still climb the high ridges above the valley floor. The dark water of Troublesome Creek is still cutting its path through the heavy limestone rock today. The same thick forest continues crowding the steep slopes looking down on the valley floor. Would you like me to dive deeper into how modern genetic testing maps these specific carrier markers backward through family lines?